Thank you for joining us for our lectionary Bible study. Today we are looking at the proper 25 in year A. Let's begin with the collect. Almighty and everlasting God, give unto us the increase of faith, hope, and charity, and that we may obtain that which thou dost promise, make us to love that which thou dost command. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who liveth and reigneth with thee and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Now, the Sunday collects are not really meant to line up thematically with the lessons, but here we do have a lineup in the commandments, and of course a lot of the summer collects talk about the commandments, so we'll be focusing on the commandments today. But also we get a reference to what are called the theological virtues: faith, hope, and love, or charity. And when we talk about theological virtues, we describe them as theological because they come from God as gifts, and they are meant to draw us to God. So theos has to do with God, so they are related on both ends to God. I like to think of it as God is going fishing for people, and it's like he casts his line and gets a hook and starts to reel in. So that means it is both a gift that comes from God and also kind of reels us in and directs us back toward God. The gifts of faith, hope, and love are imparted at baptism and nurtured by the sacrament of the Eucharist and by practice as well. Virtue basically means a good habit. Vice, correspondingly, means a bad habit. Well, let's look at the first lesson, which is from Exodus 22, verses 21 through 27. God said, "You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not afflict any widow or orphan. If you do afflict them, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with a sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be to him as a creditor, and you shall not exact interest from him. If ever you take your neighbor's garment in pledge, you shall restore it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering, it is his mantle for his body. In what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate." And you'll find throughout the Old Testament, especially in the Torah, the Law of Moses, you'll find a reference to sort of lessons learned in the experience of slavery and the Exodus. And you'll find a lot of times references back to that in describing for example, the reason why you have a Sabbath in Deuteronomy. It's because, or maybe it's the other way around, but Exodus and Deuteronomy, there's different reasons given. One is creation, and I think Deuteronomy is the one where it says you have to remember that once upon a time you were slaves in Egypt, and you didn't have a day off. So take advantage of this opportunity to have a day off. It's what God wants for you. So here again we are reminded, don't remember your past, or remember where you come from. Once upon a time you were the stranger. Think about how people treated you. Do it right this time. So it says, you shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him. And twice we get this reference to God hearing the outrage when you violate some of these commandments. And that invokes a special metaphor that's used 4 times in the Bible. First we found it in Genesis when we have the first murder between those 2 brothers, Cain and Abel. And God is walking in the garden with Cain, and he says, I can hear your brother's blood crying out to me from the ground, crying out for vengeance, crying out to get involved and fix this situation. And that's how basically Exodus begins, in much the same way, that the cry of the Hebrews in their oppression went up to heaven, and God heard, and he had compassion, and he responded. So he invokes this kind of metaphor twice in this passage. And so I think that is to convey to us especially the seriousness of this matter. Don't take it lightly. This was, remember, one of the reasons that God got involved in the whole Exodus operation in the first place, because he heard your cries of oppression, and he was compassionate and got involved. And if you end up being the Egyptians to other people, don't be surprised if God gets involved on their side this time. So imagine God sending a series of plagues upon you and saying, let these other people go. So it's very definitely a warning overall. And of course we get some specifics here that God especially is concerned about those who are on the outs, those who are disadvantaged, the widow and the orphan, and also the poor. In verse 25, there's a reference to the problem of usury. If you lend any money to my people who is poor, don't be like a creditor. Basically, read that like, don't be like a loan shark, someone who takes advantage of them. You shall not exact interest. Of course, in the Middle Ages, there was a discrepancy in interpretation between Jew and Gentile, or Jewish and Christian interpretation. So the church upheld this idea in more of kind of a blanket way. And so basically the banking business was sort of handed over, I guess you'd say, to the Jews. And there was a lot of, already you've got animosity between different people groups to start with. But then when you get the Jews control the banking industry and run all the money, well, they do because you said you weren't allowed to do it. They are. So, you created this situation. But here, it's not a blanket statement, but more of a specific statement. Don't take advantage of people. If you lend to the poor, don't be someone who uses it to keep them under your thumb. And in fact, that's kind of the same thing we get when we go to, I think it's in James, where we get the last reference to this metaphor of God hearing the outrage and getting involved. When you basically keep people under your thumb, keep them dependent, keep them in kind of a semi-enslaved condition, in the sense that they have no personal liberty because they're always, they just can't quite get ahead. You make sure you keep them in control through money and so on. Same type of thing, verse 26. If you take sort of your neighbor's last garment, his sleeping bag, as credit, you better give it back to him. It doesn't matter if it's unfair. It's unfair for him to have to give it up in the first place. That's his only covering. Make sure you look out for your neighbor. Going back to the original idea, don't oppress your neighbor. Look out for your neighbor. Even if it costs you a little bit, so what? It costs you a little bit. All really going back to, am I my brother's keeper? The answer is yes, you are. Make sure that not only you look out for him, but even more so that you don't cause him trouble, you don't oppress him. Let's turn to Psalm 1. And this is always a good illustration of the problem of gender-neutral language in the Psalter in the 1979 prayer book. And I suppose this was kind of pretty advanced for its day. I mean, you think in 1979, and this book was composed probably starting in the late 60s, at least by the early 70s. And they decided to go gender neutral, not for God, but for people. So, and that makes sense. It's not usually just men we're talking about here. It's people, men, women, and children. But the problem is when you tinker with it, you lose some of the things that are embedded in there. So if you'll consider the difference here, like in verse 1 of Psalm 1, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stood in the way of sinners, and hath not sat in the seat of the scornful. In the 79 Psalter, it says, happy are they who have not walked in the counsel of the wicked, nor lingered in the way of sinners, nor sat in the seats of the scornful. Well, first of all, there's the kind of oddity of happy. They decided to go with happy a lot of times for blessed. It could be translated that way. Blessed means, fulfilled, happy, rewarded. But the tradition of English translation sticks with blessed. So it's a little bit of oddity when they start with happy. But the problem really is they, because what it says is, blessed is the man. But they tried to make it applicable to everyone, which makes sense. That's the sense of what is being said. Blessed are they. But according to the church fathers, all of these psalms are ultimately about Jesus. So when it says, blessed is the man, who is the man? It's not everyone, except for those who find their new identity in the new man, who is Jesus Christ. So Jesus is the man, the new man, who has not walked in the counsel of the wicked. His delight is in the law of the Lord, and so on. So you lose some of that subtlety. The other is, I forget which psalm it is, I'm thinking 132, somewhere around in there, about the oil running down on the beard. How wonderful thing it is when brethren dwell together in unity. And they change it to something like...
Isn't it up there?
Oh, in the dark place? Yeah. Well, I don't know. Maybe. It's in Latin and I can't see it anyway. 133, okay.
Which is really short, on 4
And so a lot of times this is translated, they or comrades or something kind of generic. But if you look through the rest of the psalm, it's all talking about kind of manliness, with the beard and so on. So there, it's really a psalm kind of applicable to a men's group, as it were, and you kind of lose that when you go gender neutral on that. Well, let's turn back to this Psalm 1 from the Coverdale. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stood in the way of sinners, and hath not sat in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he will exercise himself day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the waterside, that will bring forth his fruit in due season. His leaf also shall not wither, and look, whatsoever he doeth, it shall prosper. And as for the ungodly, it is not so with them, but they are like the chaff, which the wind scattereth away from the face of the earth. Therefore the ungodly shall not be able to stand in the judgment, neither the sinners in the congregation of the righteous. But the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, and the way of the ungodly shall perish. So this wonderful contrast is set up between the righteous and the wicked. The righteous are like trees by the waterside. They have those deep roots. They're constantly being nourished, even when you don't see the water in the stream. Whereas the ungodly are all dried up and they blow away like the chaff. And it kind of gives you a little mental illusion to that whole thing about the wheat and the tares. And when they separate them at the harvest, they get that big grate thing and they toss them up and down like French fries. And the chaff, is very light and blows away in the wind. And the wheat is heavier and it stays there in the bin. Okay. Let's go on to 1 Thessalonians. If memory serves, I think 1 Thessalonians was one of the earliest writings of Paul, perhaps the first letter in terms of chronology that we have. 1 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 8. You yourselves know, brethren, that our visit to you was not in vain. But though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had courage in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the face of great opposition. For our appeal does not spring from error or uncleanness, nor is it made with guile. But just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please men, but to please God, who tests our hearts. For we never used either words of flattery, as you know, or a cloak for greed, as God is witness. Nor did we seek glory from men, whether from you or from others, though we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, like a nurse taking care of her children. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us. And the Church of Thessalonica was always a dear congregation to Paul, and you see that reflected in the language of his letters. So he's following up on a visit, and he begins by saying that it was really worth it coming to visit you. And there may have been problems before we got there. I don't know if that's perhaps referring to maybe there was a protest outside or something like that, or hostility from the synagogue more specifically, perhaps. But in any case, he basically says it was worth all the hassle, it was worth all the trouble. And please keep in mind that we came for a genuine, good-hearted reason. And in fact, perhaps some of that opposition and hardship kind of reveals that, that if we were just coming here to show off, we wouldn't have bothered, it wouldn't have been worth the trouble. But it was worth the trouble because you're worth the trouble. You are important to God. And so we just put our head down and got through all that. He says our appeal doesn't come with uncleanness or guile. We're not one of these snake oil salesmen. We're not a sneaky televangelist trying to sell you something or whatever. But we are genuine. We've been entrusted with the gospel. He also talks about how we're not seeking glory from you, from anybody else, this is verse 6, although we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. And so I don't know exactly what he's referring to there. I'm curious. Some of the other things that he mentions along those lines is Paul, again and again, will kind of undersell himself, or he won't take advantage of all his opportunities for luxury and things like that. So, for example, he says, I don't bring a wife in my entourage. I'm single. I tend to remain single. I think that's a good idea because that would just clutter up my life and make me less efficient. And he says this in contrast to some of the other apostles who have wives, and I guess maybe sometimes bring them along in their travels. So he says, I'm kind of lean and mean. That's my approach. And the same type of thing with, I pay my own way, even though I could rightly insist that you pay my way. And he makes a reference to that as well. But he says he doesn't want to burden these smaller, more fragile congregations with that. So he decided early on that he's going to pay his own way. He's going to be a tent maker. We're not exactly sure what that is. Someone who probably works in leather in some capacity or another. So what it is that he's referring to here, it doesn't seem to be quite either one of those categories. Perhaps there's something about some ceremonial pomp or something that is due to a solemn dignitary, guest, visitor. Perhaps something like that. Maybe he said, let's forego the big party that you would ordinarily have for someone visiting like that. Of course, in that time and place, you have a lot of cultural obligations to entertain guests and things like that. So that's all I can think of. But I'm curious exactly as to what.
Well, weren't the Sanhedrin all about that kind of stuff and beating drums and?
That was part of the example that Jesus had about denouncing their hypocrisy, that they were all fancy on the outside and rotten on the inside.
I have one thought. Could it possibly be the idea of under-promising and over-delivering?
I don't know. It's
like you're,
possible.
With that no pomp. It's like you haven't promised anything, really. You haven't set this huge expectation and then deliver in spades.
It could also be about kind of segueing with his presentation of the gospel. that Christ humbled himself, became obedient even unto death on the cross.
Sure.
That could be. But he really, again and again, you get the sense that he just wants to pull out all the stops to squeeze every drop of conversion out of everybody. So he will go to any length to do that, which is kind of what he's getting at when he talks about, I will be all things to all people, that I may at least save some of them. And that's, I think, undergirded when he gets to verse 7 and 8, talking about he was very gentle among you. He was very affectionate, and he's willing not only to share the gospel, but to share himself, to do everything he can, because you're very dear to us. Well, let's turn to the gospel, Matthew 22, verses 34 to 46. We're back in Matthew's gospel and kind of going along bit by bit. Now we are in Holy Week. So in chapter 21, he's come into the Holy City on Palm Sunday. And so we are sometime in the first part of the week here, Monday, Tuesday, something like that. So Matthew 22, verses 34 to 46. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they came together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it, You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Now while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question, saying, What do you think of the Christ? Whose son is he? They said to him, The son of David. He said to them, How is it then that David, inspired by the Spirit, calls him Lord, saying, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit at my right hand, till I put thy enemies under thy feet. If David thus calls him Lord, how is he his son? And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. Now this is, of course, very familiar to us as the summary of the law, and in the traditional prayer books in Rite 1, this is what you get if you don't use the Ten Commandments. You get the summary of the law. I'm trying to look up here. The corresponding version in Mark's Gospel, I believe, there it is, Mark 12. I'm thinking that it's the other way around, or perhaps it's in Luke, where instead of Jesus giving the answer, he asks the lawyer, and the lawyer gives the answer, and then Jesus says, That's right. Oh, that's Matthew, Mark 12. Now, Mark is Jesus answers. I don't get a reference where the version is in Luke. Oh, darn. I don't want to spend all that time looking it up. But I think in one of them it's the other way around. In any case, the summary of the law comes from two passages. And there are, in Jewish tradition, 613 mitzvot, which are commandments. A number of them, I forget what number, are positive, thou shalt, the number of negative, thou shalt not. But they ended up numbering them all at 613. It was also thought at the time that that was the same number of bones in the human body. I think later they figured out that's not quite the same, or they decided to count some things differently, like counting the vertebrae individually instead of one or something like that. Who knows? But there was a debate among the rabbis. They like to talk about these things. What's the greatest commandment? And this answer is not original to Jesus. We do find it in at least one book that preceded him. I don't have it listed here. It's something like the the teaching of the patriarchs of Israel or something like that. But the first part is from Deuteronomy 6:5, and the wider context goes like this, Deuteronomy 6:1. Now this is the commandment, the statutes, and the ordinances, which the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, Moses talking, that you may do them in the land which you are going over to possess, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son and your son's son, by keeping all his statutes and commandments, which I command you, all the days of your life, that your days may be prolonged. So he's reiterating again and again, these are for your benefit. When you go into your new home, make sure you do them. It'll go well for you. Hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord your God, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear this, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words which I command you this day shall be upon your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. And you shall bind them as a sign upon your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And so when he uses this, I think, aptly titled summary of the law, I think that's exactly what it is in this context, is that he has been reiterating the entire 613 commandments, the law of Moses. Deuteronomy is basically the farewell address when they're ready to cross over into the promised land. And again he says, hear, O Israel, hear, O Israel, hear, O Israel, follow these commandments, it's going to be beneficial to you. And he kind of really sums it up with the Shema, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and then love the Lord with all your heart, all your soul, all your might or strength. But perhaps that's not a complete statement, or maybe something else needs to be added to make it explicitly complete. And that, of course, is where we get the second half, love your neighbor as yourself. He says there's one that's just like it. And when he says there's one just like it, I think what he's getting at is these go together. You can't really pull apart love of God and love of neighbor. In fact, we always see these things intertwined. Think of the 10 Commandments. There's 2 tables. One table represents the commandments related to us and God, and the other table relates to commandments between other people. So the first 4 are all about God. Don't worship idols, only worship God, don't take his name in vain, keep the Sabbath holy. And then we go on, the rest of them are all about other people. Honor your father and mother, don't commit adultery, don't kill, don't steal, and so on. And you can never pull those apart. Like, well, okay, I'll keep this half, but I'm going to ignore the other half. It doesn't work that way. If you love the Lord your God, then you have to love your neighbor. And if you love your neighbor, that is an act of loving the Lord your God, who made both of you and loves you both. And so Leviticus 19, the wider context goes like this, starting in verse 11. And again, this is reiterating some of the commandments. You shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another. You shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of the Lord your God. I am the Lord. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired servant shall not remain with you all night till the morning. You shall not curse the deaf, or put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor. You shall not go up and down as a slanderer among your people. You shall not stand forth against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason with your neighbor, lest you bear sin because of him. So this is all leading up to this kind of summary. You shall not take vengeance or bear any grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Now, when it says neighbor, what it means is a fellow Israelite. And we should be aware of that. In fact, you find that alluded to in that last commandment there. don't take vengeance or bear any grudge against not other people, but against the son of your own people. In other words, your neighbor, a fellow Israelite. Now, it doesn't say you're allowed to treat the stranger among you differently. It says explicitly the opposite. Treat the stranger, the sojourner, as if he were your neighbor. So there's no discrepancy in terms of practice, but it's recognizing that there's different categories already in terms of people's outlook on life. And so it uses those categories when laying down the law.
I vividly remember Padre saying, "Thou shalt not kill," and that meant Jews. You could kill all the Maculates if you could, or something like that. And first time I heard that.
Well, and when it says thou shalt not kill, what it means is thou shalt not murder. And that's explicitly the word that is used, ratzak, which is never used in a generic way like kill, like our word kill. And it's really unfortunate that somehow that word choice was made in at least the King James. I don't know about other translations, but it's always murder. In fact, I guess it comes from the Great Bible. The translation used in the prayer book has always been murder. And in fact, if you look at it in context, that only makes sense because it goes on to command the killing of people as penalties for crimes. There's 10 of them that follow right after that in the same chapter as the 10 Commandments.
May I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
You just said it, but did I understand you to say it's unfortunate that we're left with the translation of the word to kill rather than the distinction of murder?
Right.
Because we all understand when the distinction between the two. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a lot of people that don't really know the Bible well, don't know the context of that verse, think it's thou shalt not kill, which is not exactly what it says. That's a possible translation, but that's a little bit misleading when you have a more specific word used in the original and a more specific word available in the English.
Do you think that when, I think there's a lot of accounts of, let's take World War II, I'll just pick them as the most recent, or let's say Korean War. And I'm not specifically not choosing Vietnam, those two conflicts where one of our people has had to kill someone in combat, and then you hear about them being really plagued when they get back. Do you think that plague comes from the way we are raised up, the way it's explained, like the burden, they feel burdened because of that translation?
Well, it certainly could be a factor. Does thou shalt not, for anyone who may be watching and listening and didn't hear, does thou shalt not kill sort of increase the burden of those who had to kill in war and were righteous kills, let's call them that? Probably, but I don't think necessarily. I think in and of itself, taking another human being's life is a very grave thing and something that you just don't want to do. And I think you could make an analogy to when you have to discipline your children. And, some people just can't handle it. They don't want to do anything in way of discipline, no matter what strategy or act it is, whether it's spanking or no television or whatever. They just can't handle it. So I think inherently it is a very grave matter. And so regardless of the justification or the righteousness of it, I think it's very difficult to deal with inherently.
Does this colic come up more than once during the year?
I don't think it comes up more than once. The colics are prescribed for different Sundays throughout the year, and the themes of it come up multiple times. So that's probably why it sounds very familiar. Like I know the faith, hope, and charity comes up in one used in Epiphany. I remember that one explicitly because it has very archaic language and it's kind of fun to try to say out loud. Of course, the whole thing about commandments is kind of all through the summer. Basically it's, Lord, help us to know what to do and actually follow your commandments. Follow through with it.
And make us to love that which thou dost command.
Because when you love what you're doing, it's easier to do it. The Lord loves a cheerful giver. He will take from a grouch, but he loves A cheerful river. So that's the first half of the gospel, is that response. And this is kind of paired with an earlier interchange with the Pharisees. So basically, Jesus is kind of running through the opposition to him during this Holy Week. And each group kind of has their final farewell, as it were, of, this is the final word on whether we're going to be open to you, supporting you, or against you. And so perhaps this represents that for the Sadducees. The Pharisees are a lot closer to Jesus in terms of theological outlook than the Sadducees are. The Sadducees are much different. And Sadducees represent more the aristocracy than the Pharisees.
But the Pharisees have the worst reputation, kind of, sort of. I mean, you use that, seems to me, everybody knows that the Pharisees, beware of the Pharisees,
Well, and over time, Pharisee basically became a synonym for hypocrite because of the gospel. Mm-hmm. But that's perhaps a little bit of an unfair characterization just through exposure. And we also should keep in mind how it's just human nature kind of thing to be more antagonistic to those who are closer to you. I've mentioned this before. It's like, I've argued with a whole lot of Episcopalians about stuff. I don't think I've ever argued with a Presbyterian or a Methodist or, and that's just because people who are in more close proximity to you in terms of the issues you're talking about and all that, you bump against each other more often. If we were going to put Paul, certainly, Jesus as well, into a theological group of New Testament Jews, I think you would have to call them Pharisees. And remember also, Pharisees, they started out as a renewal movement, kind of back to the Bible, back to the basics. Let's actually keep the law of Moses. Let's not just give it lip service. They believed in all the things that the Christian church believed in, the resurrection of the dead, angels, all that kind of stuff that the Sadducees did not. So the Pharisees were criticized for their hypocrisy, and I think a lot of that was that they had such high hopes for the Pharisees, and that movement really let everyone down when they kind of lost their reason for being. I think I've mentioned this before. It makes me think back to that movie L.A. Confidential, where there's one scene in the kitchen where the police officer, Jack Vincennes, is being asked by his fellow cop. They're like waiting for somebody, and they're talking, well, how did you join the service? Why did you join the service? And that police officer, he gets kind of a blank look in his face, and he says, I don't remember. And it's kind of coming off on a whole storyline about corruption and that kind of thing, You got started because you had this impulse to make the world a better place. And one guy tells this story about why he became a cop, because I wanted to make the world right because of what happened to me. And then the other guy says, I'm sure I had a reason like that too, but it's been so long, I don't even remember anymore. I get set in my ways. In verse 41, we get a mention of the Pharisees, and it's not clear as to whether this is the same scene or whether there's been some time and distance in between if we moved on to another occasion. But there were Pharisees gathered together, and it says, now the while. I wonder if my other translation might have a clue. Let's see, that's verse 41. So it says, now the while. I don't know if that is a way of saying now at the same time. I think that's what it's alluding to. But in any case, he's talking to a different audience. So the Pharisees, they have their chance to try to trip him up, and they bomb on that one. Because there's certainly no opposition to his answer. They say, well, yeah, I guess. What do you have to say to that? But the Pharisees ask him a question. What do you think of the Christ, the Messiah? Who is he? And this is a lot more pointed, because perhaps They want him to say, well, it's me, you know. But he doesn't want to be quite that forward. And he responds that the Messiah is the son of David. Well, yeah, everybody knows that. And then he said to them, and where he's going is he wants to make the point that the Messiah is divine. That it's not just what they're usually thinking of, which is an earthly king who's very successful, kind of a Jewish Alexander the Great. I think that's what a lot of the Jewish people were looking for, and they had suffered under Greek oppression, and I think that informed their expectations and outlook a lot more than perhaps is usually reckoned and realized, is that, you know, when are we going to get a chance to be a great empire? When are we going to be the ones laying down the law for everybody else? Why can't we have a Jewish Alexander the Great? And I think they read a lot into that, about this promise of a son of David, a king from his royal house, to take the throne and be the greatest king ever. So he alludes to, which psalm is this? This is Psalm 110. And this is often used as a proof of Christ's deity, how he's invoking this psalm. So Jesus says to them, the Pharisees, how is it then that David, inspired by the Spirit, you know, speaking true words, not just complaining and whining to God, and we shouldn't take that as a commandment, but speaking prophetically, calls the Messiah Lord, saying, Jehovah said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I put thy enemies under thy feet. So he says that, well, if David calls him Lord, how is he his son? In other words, how does David address someone who doesn't exist yet as his son? And of course, the unspoken rhetorical answer is, he already exists. He existed from all eternity. He is the Son of God. But it says nobody was able to answer him. And they didn't bother to ask him any more questions either. They were done.
Well, sometimes when you talk about that passage right there, I feel like the white-faced sheep, you know, he always gets it wrong. You know, you're talking about David's talking about the Christ is divine. Mm-hmm. And that gets real tricky in there. The Lord says, my Lord. You know,
and it's Yahweh said to Adoni, or whatever this possessive ending is, I forget. So it's the divine name says to literally my Lord. And that's also he's saying that the Messiah is the Lord of David, his ancestor. And so in this Holy Week, he is revealing himself again, as he's done several times before, as the ultimate commentator on the law, because he's the one who gave the law in the beginning. And the church fathers are clear on that Jesus is throughout the Old Testament as the second person of the Trinity, revealing the law of Moses, that he is the one in the burning bush, that he is the one on the mountain speaking with Moses, and so on.
And he is the one in the Psalms.
Mm-hmm. And so he is the authentic interpreter of his own words. And of course, he is the Messiah, the son of David, and he is David's Lord. He is David's God and King.
Well, from this point forward, after this exchange, more or less, are the Jews saying, okay, we got to get rid of this guy now?
Yeah, they're not to that point yet. In fact, I'm thinking this probably takes place on Monday, because it kind of just gets worse throughout the week. And then traditionally Wednesday is reckoned as the day where Judas made the deal to hand him over for 30 pieces of silver. So that's why it's called in Holy Week Spy Wednesday. Mm-hmm. And that's why Wednesday became a day of fasting and penance for most of Christian history on the church calendar.
I have a book, or had a book, that it was a fiction, and I want to say like Michael J. Fox, but that's not right. And it's he demonstrates, he uses the trial is a lynch mob.
Mhm.
I mean, there's no Advent part of Jewish law over and over and over again. The weeks of Holy Week are in opposition of Jewish law. They had stuff at night. You're not supposed to do stuff at night. And, you know, the witnesses were not. You know,
Yeah.
they
A lot of shenanigans going
Yes.
on.
You know, it's just like the old Texas joke: bring the guilty prisoner in. So, you know what I'm talking about, Stephen? There was a book, not like, it's a very short book. It's the shenanigans of Holy Week by the Jews.
And you think it's Michael J. Fox?
No, it's not Michael J. Fox, but it's somebody. Oh, I know who he is, but
Can you give more description about it?
no, I'll have to go find it.
Yeah.
But evidently, have you not read that about all
You-
the things that the Jews did wrong?
Well, I've heard that before. I'm not familiar with the precise book
Alright.
that you referred to, although you've talked about it before.
The
It's interesting though, I wasn't aware